Well, today we're going to talk about how the third generation Firebird that you see here inspired a critical design element of the C8 Corvette that was introduced almost 4 decades later. Sounds hard to believe, but is actually quite true. Now, the third generation Firebird that you see here is the inaugural year 1982 model. And this is my personal car. It's actually the oldest car that I have in my collection in terms of my ownership. I've owned this car for, it's hard to believe, about 20 plus years. And I haven't owned anything else longer. The thing that's interesting for me is that I have to say that I fell in love with this car's looks growing up on watching Knight Rider on television. And I didn't want a replica kit car, but I thought that the design was just a beautiful design, and I found this car in Minnesota back in 2005, and it had 29,000 miles at the time. It has 32,000 miles now, and I just fell in love with the red on black. Just thought it was absolutely gorgeous, and I think this car is a gorgeous car. And I have to say, I especially love the wheel-to-body proportions. This car only has 15-inch wheels, but they look just fine on the car because, take a look at the fender. There's not much height to the fender above the wheel. It has this beautifully sculpted wheel arch, just delicately filleted, and you have this just stunning, I would say, taper to the front end that the hood kind of rises up to the point where it peaks just over top of the wheel, then the belt line kind of dips down again, then dips back up and carries over the rear wheel. It's just a fantastic looking vehicle. But let's go back a little bit in the Firebird design history to talk about the inspiration that I'm mentioning. And I think people on this channel are going to find this interesting. So as I mentioned, this is the third generation Firebird. Of course, the Firebird came out in 1967 along with the Camaro. And this was General Motors' response to the so-called pony car era from Ford that was kicked off with the Ford Mustang and followed up later by the Mercury Cougar. General Motors, of course, had to enter this particular space since the Mustang was so gosh darn popular, and it came out with the Firebird. That first generation Firebird would last until the second generation Firebird was introduced partway through the 1970 model year. And that 1970 and a half, let's call it Firebird, lasted all the way through to 1981. It was just an extremely long run in terms of the vehicle. And this was in part because General Motors was experiencing some financial difficulties over the years. It was supposed to be cycled out sooner, similar to the Corvette that lasted from 1968 all the way through to 1982. And, both kind of worked fine, but were getting a bit tired by the point that they were at the end of their run. And then the 1982 Firebird, the third generation, was just an all-new vehicle and a beautiful one at that. But when the 1982 Firebird was being conceived, of course, one of the things that designers do is put together a series of sketches to try to come up with the appropriate theme for the car. And here you have a sketch that really helps set the direction for the third generation Firebird. And this, I have to say, might be one of the most famous sketches in all of automotive history. It was done by Roger Hewitt, a GM designer who sketched a number of vehicles during his time at GM, including a beautiful one of a so-called four-fendered Farkle Oldsmobile Tornado. And I have to say, I've seen these sketches in person, and unfortunately the pictures just don't do them justice. The lighting, the highlights, the shadows, the shading, the background, everything about them is just perfection. And by the way, if you talk to any automotive designer, especially one from GM, they will know both of these sketches. And chances are, if they've been around for a while, they will know Roger Hewitt and who he was. Unfortunately, he passed away a number of years ago. But regardless, this sketch here is what really set the design direction, as I mentioned, for the Firebird for 1982. Of course, the production version is significantly different, but you can see that kind of undulating belt line that the production variant has. A little bit of that basket handle too, styling. Notice that the area behind the front door has that basket handle, almost like a hidden B-pillar under glass in this particular sketch. And I think the sketch is just absolutely fantastic overall. Now, once a sketch is complete, designers start moving on to scale models Because remember, the sketch is just a two-dimensional form, and then you're trying to take that and make a three-dimensional form out of it. And this is where artists, and when they eventually get to clay models, clay modelers are extremely important, because just because the sketch looks great in two dimensions doesn't mean that the car in three-dimensional form looks great. So here you see a scale model, and this is one of the tricks that designers employ. There's really only half of a scale model here. It's half of a car, and then it's put up against a mirror so that you can kind of cheat and get a full vehicle while only doing the work of half of it. But while the sketch was mouth-watering, I think the scale model here was even more mouth-watering. Probably was not something that was readily able to be productionized, because look at how low that front end is. I can't imagine that that was something that was going to be able to meet the bumper impact standards of the time. But nonetheless, this was probably still in the unconstrained, let's say, form where designers were instructed to come up with what they thought was the best model before the production constraints were put on it. And the two individuals that you see here at the left of the photo is Bill Porter. He was Pontiac studio chief during the 1970s. He led the design of everything from the 1970 GTO to really anything that came out of Pontiac during that era. And he worked on a number of cars prior to that. While he wasn't the chief designer of Pontiac in the 1960s, he certainly had a hand in many of them. Later became Buick chief designer. To the right of Bill Porter is Dave Holes, who was, I believe at this point, Bill's boss, and he was the executive in charge of a number of GM studios. And you can see them both standing here marveling at this particular scale model. So what do I mean by the fact that the third generation Firebird inspired the C8 Corvette? Well, take a look at the scale model and the wheels that you see here. They almost look like a snowflake. And Pontiac had snowflake wheels, but these are kind of a variant on the snowflake, a next generation. And I wonder if that's where Roger Hewitt was going when he sketched the wheels in his sketch. You notice that the same wheels that are on the model are here on Roger Hewitt's sketch. Beautifully detailed and unmistakable, let's say. So now let's fast forward in time to 2020 when the C8 was introduced, and take a look at one of the particular wheel variants that was used on the C8. Does that design look familiar to you? Does it bear any passing resemblance to the sketch that you just saw and the scale model that you saw before that? I have to believe that the sketch and that scale model really inspired this wheel, because that Firebird sketch is still known within the halls of General Motors, particularly by the design team that worked on the C8 Corvette, which included many General Motors veteran designers who had been there for decades, like Tom Peters and John Cafaro. Those individuals had worked at GM all the way back into the early 1980s. And so I'm pretty sure that they were aware of that sketch. And as a result, maybe it drew the inspiration for the wheels that you see. Here they are on another picture of a C8 Corvette. And again, I think it's quite unmistakable. They look exactly like the wheels on the Pontiac that you saw before. The interesting thing, though, is that I think that these were trying to emulate kind of the pattern in a snowflake and be, like I said, the next generation snowflake wheel for Pontiac, because Pontiac had that honeycomb wheel and the snowflake wheel. So there was this heritage associated with the wheels. Here, there was no heritage associated with a so-called snowflake wheel on the Corvette. I'm going to dub it the snowflake wheel, even though I don't think that that's what they call it on the Corvette. And here I'll close out with a particularly attractive variant of that wheel. Here you have the 5 major spokes that are done in a bit brighter finish than the little, I'll call them minor branches or spokes. I think this looks fantastic. This might be my favorite variant of the wheel, and this was not something that was in the sketch or on the scale model that you saw, the Firebird. So the Corvette designers really came up with something quite novel and I think beautiful, and it suits the car, despite the fact that the Corvette didn't really have any of that snowflake wheel heritage that I mentioned before. So after seeing the Corvette wheels and seeing this sketch, which is probably from the late 1970s, what do you think? Do you think the GM designers took inspiration from the sketch in creating that wheel? Again, here's the sketch, and then here's the wheel. It looks pretty similar to me. Let me know in the comments section, and if you enjoy these kind of pieces of design history. Thanks again for watching.